Welcome to Starbound's second channel. My name is Aurum, I'll be your narrator today. But before we get into today's story, please check below to see if you've subscribed to the channel. It's 100% free and just allows our stories to pop up on your feed more often.
Senior Administrator Flim huffed as he adjusted his bulk in the chair that was at least 2 sizes too small. The Department of Lost Colonies had budget for everything except decent furniture. He glared at the holographic display floating above his desk, showing grainy satellite footage from planet Ragnarok. "Freeze image. Enhance Sector 4, he ordered. The computer complied, and the image zoomed in on what appeared to be crude structures nestled in a dense jungle canopy. More disturbing were the bipedal figures moving between them. "How is that possible?" Flim muttered, his pale skin flushing a mottled purple with irritation. He pulled up the historical records with a flick of his pudgy fingers. Prisoner transport vessel Rehabilitation crashed on Ragnarok approximately 60 standard years ago, owned by Frontier Corrections Corporation, which filed for bankruptcy shortly after the incident. No rescue mission mounted. All 214 human inmates and 23 human crew presumed dead. Flim grunted. Paperwork. That's all this meant. Mountains of tedious, bureaucratic paperwork. His 3-chambered heart sank at the thought. A message flashed on his screen, Director Toom requesting his presence immediately. Flim heaved himself up and trudged down the sterile corridor to the director's office. "You've seen the footage?" Director Toom asked without preamble. The older alien's skin hung in loose folds, a sign of his advanced age. "Yes, Director. Disappointing. I'll dispatch a recovery team to collect remains and salvage any technology." Director Toom fixed him with all 4 of his eyes. "It's not that simple, Administrator. These may be living humans. Survivors." Flim scoffed. "After 60 years on Ragnarok, the atmosphere alone would probably kill them within months, not to mention the predators. Nevertheless, regulations are clear. If there's even a possibility of human survivors, we must follow first contact protocols." Flim felt his stomach sink. "Surely that's not necessary for primitive survivors." "Regulations, Administrator. You will assemble a scientific survey team, and you will include a human diplomat." "A diplomat? For savages?" Flim couldn't hide his disdain. "Humans are merchants and negotiators. What good will fancy words do in a jungle death world?" "The regulations exist for a reason," Director Toom said firmly. "Humans have been valuable members of the galactic community since their ascension. Their diplomatic corps is widely respected. You will follow protocol." Flim knew when he was beaten. "Yes, Director. I'll make the arrangements." "You'll lead the expedition personally," Director Toom added, making Flim's day even worse. "As you wish," he grumbled, already mentally canceling his vacation plans. Ambassador James Bronson stood at the viewport of his quarters on New Geneva Station, staring at the stars. The message from the Department of Lost Colonies had arrived an hour ago, and he was still processing its implications. Survivors on Ragnarok, after 60 years. If it was true, it would be unprecedented. But James had learned long ago that humans had a knack for doing the impossible when backed into a corner. A chime at his door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter!" he called. His aide, a fresh-faced kid barely out of the academy, stepped in with the data tablet.
"Sir, I've compiled the briefing materials on Ragnarok and the expedition team."
"Give me the highlights, Davis."
"Yes, sir. Planet Ragnarok, Class 4 Death World. Atmosphere contains hallucinogenic spores. Flora includes numerous carnivorous species. Fauna features at least 6 apex predator types. The dominant predators hunt in packs and display problem-solving intelligence.
James whistled. Sounds like a party. And we're going in with?
A research vessel, sir. The Inquiry. Minimal armaments, standard scientific equipment. The team will be led by Administrator Flim of the Department of Lost Colonies. Primarily researchers and a small security contingent.
James frowned. That won't be enough if there are hostile survivors.
The department doesn't believe any humans could have survived, sir. They think the footage shows, well, feral remnants at best.
James walked to his closet and pulled out his travel case. And they're in for a surprise. He began packing his diplomatic uniforms, then paused, reaching to the back of the closet where a locked case sat. His fingers hesitated over the biometric lock before pressing down. Inside lay mementos of a life before diplomacy, medals from military service, photographs of his old squad, and beneath them, a worn combat knife in a leather sheath. He looked at it for a long moment before adding it to his bag.
Sir?
Davis looked confused.
Is that standard diplomatic equipment?
James smiled thinly. Let's call it a cultural artifact. Get me everything you can on long-term survival scenarios and adaptation to toxic environments. The research vessel Inquiry was exactly what James expected. Sleek, sterile, and utterly unprepared for what they might find on Ragnarok. He strode up the boarding ramp, ignoring the curious looks from the alien crew members. His diplomatic uniform fit perfectly, but after years of wearing it, he still felt like he was in costume. Administrator Flim waited at the top of the ramp, his round body stuffed into an administration uniform that strained at the seams. His pale skin had a grayish tint that James recognized as the Plenid equivalent of unhealthy.
Ambassador Bronson,
Flim said with the bare minimum of courtesy.
welcome aboard the Inquiry. I trust your quarters will be adequate for this short mission.
James smiled with diplomatic polish. I'm sure they'll be fine, Administrator. I've learned to be adaptable. Flim made a noise that might have been a scoff.
Yes, well, the briefing will begin in 1 hour. Try not to get lost.
He waddled away without another word. A slender alien with mottled green skin approached.
Ambassador, I am Dr. Prill, chief scientist for this expedition. It's an honor to meet you.
James shook her hand carefully, mindful of the fragile bone structure typical of her species. The honor is mine, Doctor. I look forward to working with you.
I must confess,
Dr. Prill said.
I am fascinated by the possibility of human adaptation to Ragnarok's environment. If survivors exist, the implications for xenobiology would be revolutionary.
Humans are full of surprises, James replied neutrally. A stocky alien with rust-colored skin and a security uniform approached next.
Krill, head of security,
he said gruffly.
My team will ensure your safety, Ambassador.
James noted the standard issue stunners on the security team's belts. No lethal weapons. Confident or careless? Probably both. Appreciate that, Chief Krill, though I'm curious about your threat assessment for this mission. Krill shrugged.
If any human survives, they'll be primitive at best. No real threat to our technology.
James kept his expression neutral. You might be surprised what desperation and 60 years of adaptation can produce. Krill laughed.
With respect, Ambassador, we know humans well. Clever traders, smooth talkers, like yourself. But Ragnarok isn't a negotiating table.
No, James agreed quietly. It's not. The briefing was exactly as James expected. Scientists excited about discovery, security personnel dismissive of risks, and Flim clearly annoyed about being stuck babysitting the lot of them. When Dr. Prill finished her presentation on Ragnarok's environment, James raised his hand. Doctor, your analysis suggests the atmospheric spores cause hallucinations, paranoia, and eventually psychosis in most species. Have you considered what 60 years of exposure might do to human physiology specifically? Dr. Prill blinked her large eyes.
An interesting question, Ambassador. We assume any survivors would have experienced severe cognitive and physical degradation. Preliminary models suggest that humans are naturally somewhat more immune, but in time react similarly to the atmospheric conditions.
Meaning?
They would no longer be recognizably human in their behavior.
James nodded slowly. I recommend we bring heavier weapons, just in case. Flim laughed, a wheezing sound that grated on James's ears.
Ambassador, if anyone has survived, they'll be barely functioning primitives. Your diplomatic skills will be wasted, but certainly not in danger.
James looked at him steadily. Administrator, humans evolved as predators. We're built to adapt, to survive. If they've been on Ragnarok for 60 years, they've done the same. Adapted, maybe even specialized for it.
Specialized for what?
Asked one of the junior scientists. Killing whatever tries to kill them, James replied simply. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Flim broke it with an exaggerated sigh.
Yes. Well, thank you for that colorful perspective, Ambassador. We'll stick with standard protocols.
He turned to the group.
We reach Ragnarok in 18 hours. Get some rest.
As the briefing dispersed, Creel approached James.
You actually believe humans could adapt to Ragnarok?
James considered his answer carefully. Let me ask you something, Chief. What do you know about human history before we joined the galactic community? Creel shrugged.
Not much. You developed faster than light travel, made contact, established trade agreements, standard ascension story.
And before that, what do you know about how we related to each other?
I understand there were conflicts,
Creel said diplomatically. James smiled without humor. That's one word for it. Get some rest, Chief. Tomorrow might be educational. Ragnarok looked beautiful from orbit. Swirling green and blue land masses wrapped in wispy white clouds. Like most death worlds, it disguised its deadliness behind beauty. The landing was smooth. They touched down in a small clearing about 3 kilometers from the suspected crash site. Primary atmospheric readings confirmed the presence of hallucinogenic spores, though at lower concentrations than expected. Everyone except James donned breathing filters.
Ambassador,
Dr. Prill said with concern.
Your filter.
James shook his head. If there are any survivors, they'll be breathing this air. I need to know what we're dealing with. Flim rolled his eyes.
Your funeral.
The jungle that surrounded their landing zone was unlike anything James had seen before. Massive trees with bark the color of dried blood stretched hundreds of meters upward. Vines thick as a man's arm twisted before them, some gently undulating despite the absence of wind. The ground was covered in a carpet of moss-like growth that seemed to shift colors as they watched.
Beautiful,
Dr. Prill murmured, already taking samples. Deadly, James corrected. Nothing evolves to be this colorful unless it's poisonous or mimicking something that is. Creel's security team established a perimeter, setting up sensor posts around the landing site. Standard procedure. Textbook execution. James watched them with growing unease. "Your men should establish lookout points," he suggested to Creel. "Physical eyes, not just sensors." Creel gave him a patronizing look.
Our sensors can detect any organism larger than a rodent within a kilometer radius, Ambassador. Technology over manpower.
James didn't argue further. Sometimes lessons had to be learned the hard way. As the camp was established, James found himself drawn to the edge of the clearing. He stood still, letting his senses adjust to the jungle's rhythms. The cacophony of alien sounds, clicks, hoots, distant bellows, gradually resolved into distinct patterns. But under it all was a silence that didn't belong, a watchful silence. "We're being observed," he said quietly to Flim, who had waddled over to hurry him back to camp.
No,
Flim said dismissively.
the sensors would have...
"Forget the sensors. We're being watched. Right now." Flim squinted into the jungle, seeing nothing but shadows and strange colors.
Ambassador, with all due respect, the spores might already be affecting your perception. Perhaps you should wear a filter after all.
James didn't bother arguing. The aliens wouldn't understand until it was demonstrated to them. Night fell with alarming suddenness on Ragnarok, the jungle plunging from twilight to pitch darkness in minutes. The camp's lights created a bubble of artificial day, beyond which lay impenetrable shadow. The security team rotated shifts, with 2 guards always on duty while the others rested. James didn't sleep. He sat near the center of camp, watching the perimeter, waiting. It happened just after local midnight. One moment, Guard Tellis was at his post, scanning the darkness with a bored expression. The next, he was simply gone. No sound, no struggle, just gone. The camp exploded into activity when the disappearance was discovered. Creel barking orders, security personnel sweeping the perimeter with weapons drawn, scientists huddled in the center of camp. James followed Creel to the spot where Tellis had vanished. "What do your sensors say?" Creel checked his device, confusion clear on his face.
Nothing. No alert. No sign of intrusion.
James knelt, examining the ground. There, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for, a partial footprint in the soft soil. Bare human foot, larger than normal, with elongated toes that had dug in for traction. "Your sensors were disabled," James said.
The technology
"Was defeated by someone who understood its limitations." James pointed to the nearest sensor post. The aliens couldn't see what James saw. The tiny, crushed leaves beneath it. The slightly altered angle. "Check the post." Creel did, and his face registered shock.
It's been moved. Just a few millimeters, but enough to create a blind spot.
He looked at James with new respect.
You think the survivors did this?
"I know they did," James replied. They never found Tellis. The next morning, the expedition pushed deeper into the jungle toward the crash site. The atmosphere was tense, the security team jumpy after the night's events. James walked near the front, senses alert for any sign of threat or observation. They hadn't gone 2 kilometers when they found the first warning. It hung from a massive tree, the carcass of a predator unlike anything in the expedition's biological database. Roughly the size of a tiger, with 6 limbs and a jaw that could have engulfed a man's torso. It had been systematically skinned, its meat harvested, its bones broken and reset into an unnatural position that almost resembled a human hand making a stop gesture. Dr. Prill approached it with scientific curiosity, scanning it with her instruments.
Fascinating. This species isn't in our records.
It's a warning, James said. Flim scoffed.
More likely a kill, hung up to keep scavengers away from a settlement.
No. James pointed to the careful positioning, the deliberate arrangement. This was placed here, at this exact spot, because it's the most likely approach route to the crash site. It's not random, it's communication. As they continued, more warnings appeared. Skulls of various predators mounted on crude spikes, territorial markers made from bones and what appeared to be dried blood. Strange symbols carved into tree trunks, not any human language James recognized, but clearly deliberate patterns.
Primitive superstition,
Dr. Prill declared, though her voice lacked conviction. James didn't bother correcting her. The evidence of human activity was clear to him, but the aliens still didn't understand what they were seeing. They were interpreting through their own filters, seeing primitive rituals, barbaric displays. James saw what they couldn't: systematic psychological warfare. These warnings were designed to frighten, to deter, to give whatever lurked in this jungle every possible advantage over intruders. They reached the crash site by midday. After 60 years, little remained of the prison transport. The jungle had reclaimed most of it, vines and moss covering the twisted metal framework. What was most telling was what wasn't there. Anything usable had been systematically stripped. No panels, no wiring, no technology remained. This wasn't scavenged, James observed. It was harvested, methodically.
For primitive shelters, perhaps,
Dr. Prill suggested. For weapons, James corrected. As the team spread out to examine the wreckage, another guard disappeared, silently, without warning. Then a research assistant. Panic began to spread through the remaining team members. James pulled Flim aside. "We're being hunted." Flim's skin had paled to an unhealthy white.
We should retreat to the ship.
"We're not being allowed to retreat," James said. "Look at the pattern of disappearances. We're being pushed in a specific direction, away from the western quadrant." He pointed to the dense jungle to their east. "They want us to go that way."
Ray, you actually believe humans are responsible for this?
I know they are, and they're not just taking people randomly. They're removing threats in priority order. The most capable guards first, then anyone examining the wreckage too closely. They're controlling our movement. Flim stared at him, really seeing him for perhaps the first time.
How do you know this?
"Because it's what I would do," James answered simply. As if to punctuate his statement, a scream tore through the jungle. The first actual sound from any of the victims. Everyone froze.
That was Meave,
Creel said, his voice tight.
"Eastern perimeter."
They rushed toward the sound, but James held back, watching the tree line to the west instead. There, a flicker of movement, a shadow that didn't match the jungle's patterns. James caught the briefest glimpse of a human figure, but one twisted by adaptation. Elongated limbs, skin mottled with what might have been deliberate scarring, face obscured by a mask made from what looked like a predator's skull. It vanished before James could alert the others. They found Meave's equipment, but no sign of the researcher himself. Just as they were about to move on, a high-pitched whistling sound cut through the air. 3 guards dropped instantly, tiny darts protruding from their necks. "Take cover!" James shouted, diving behind a section of the crashed ship's hull. Chaos erupted. The remaining security personnel fired blindly into the jungle while the scientists cowered behind whatever protection they could find. James watched in grim fascination as figures moved through the trees with inhuman speed, darting between cover, never staying still long enough to present a target. A guard fell to a bowler that wrapped around his legs, barbs digging deep into his flesh. Another was taken by a net that dropped from above, hoisting him struggling into the canopy. The attack was coordinated, efficient, and terrifyingly effective. When it ended, half the expedition was gone. The survivors huddled in a clearing, shell-shocked and terrified.
We need to get back to the ship,
Flim said, his voice shaking. Agreed, James said. But we go carefully. Together. As they began their retreat, James positioned himself at the rear of the group. He had noticed something the others hadn't. The attacks had been non-lethal. The darts were tranquilizers, not poison. The bolas were designed to incapacitate, not kill. Even the nets were carefully weighted to capture without causing fatal injury. These weren't the actions of mindless savages. This was containment, herding. They had gone less than a kilometer when the ground shook with a massive explosion. A pillar of smoke rose from the direction of their landing site.
The ship,
Creel said needlessly.
How?
Flim whispered.
Primitives couldn't.
They're not primitives. James cut him off. They've had 60 years to adapt, to learn, to prepare for visitors. We're not dealing with survivors. We're dealing with a new culture that evolved from the survivors. Before anyone could respond, another wave of attacks came from all sides. This time, James was ready. When a figure dropped from the trees directly in front of him, James was already moving. He deflected the crude spear with one arm while striking with his other hand, catching his attacker across the jaw. The figure, a human male covered in mud and ritualistic scars, seemed shocked by the resistance. James used that moment of surprise to his advantage, following with a kick that sent the man stumbling backward. For a moment, they locked eyes. The feral human's pupils were massively dilated, likely a side effect of the atmospheric spores. But there was intelligence there, and something like recognition. The moment passed. Another attacker struck James from behind, and darkness claimed him. James woke to pain and motion. He was being carried through the jungle, bound but not gagged, slung between two of the feral humans like a hunting trophy. Around him, he could see the other survivors receiving similar treatment. Flim looked on the verge of cardiovascular failure, his pale skin now almost transparent with fear. The jungle changed as they traveled, becoming denser, darker. The vegetation took on more threatening aspects. Thorns that dripped viscous fluid, flowers that snapped shut as they passed, fungal growths that puffed spores into the air. Their captors navigated it all with ease, avoiding dangers that would have been invisible to the expedition members. Finally, they reached their destination. A massive cave entrance set into a cliff face, partially concealed by the jungle growth. Skulls of various predators lined the approach, a warning more explicit than words could convey. Inside, the cave opened into a vast system. Parts natural, parts clearly excavated. Crude lighting came from bioluminescent fungi cultivated in strategic locations. As James's eyes adjusted, he saw the true extent of what the survivors had built. A village existed within the caves. Living quarters carved into the walls, storage areas filled with salvaged materials, training grounds where young humans practiced with weapons. Women worked at crafting stations, sharpening blades or mixing substances in crude bowls. Children, human children born on this death world, stared at the captives with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. The entire society was built around survival and combat. Every tool served multiple purposes. Every adult bore the scars of countless battles. Even the children moved with a predatory grace that spoke of harsh training. Their captors brought them to a central chamber and cut their bonds. James immediately took a defensive stance, but made no aggressive moves. The others huddled together, Flim nearly catatonic with fear.
My God,
Dr. Prill whispered, her curiosity overcoming her fear.
they've adapted physically.
She was right. These humans were different. Thicker, scarred skin, enhanced musculature, elongated limbs and fingers, teeth that had been filed to points. Years of exposure to Ragnarok's environment had changed them. A murmur ran through the gathered feral humans. They parted as a new figure approached, a massive, scarred behemoth of a man. Where the others had dozens of scars, he had hundreds, some clearly ritualistic. One eye was milky white, the other an unnaturally bright blue. He wore a necklace of claws and teeth, and his bare chest was painted with symbols in what looked like fresh blood.
"Your chief!"
One of their captors announced in a guttural approximation of standard language. The chief studied them, his single good eye lingering on James. When he spoke, his voice was a rumble, the words broken and accented, but intelligible.
"No, not be long. Death place, hunger comes."
Flim found his voice.
"We mean no harm. We thought everyone died in the crash."
The chief grunted.
"No die. Become strong. Adapt.
He thumped his scarred chest.
Become jungle."
James stepped forward, meeting the chief's gaze directly. "You were trying to drive us away, not kill us." The chief nodded once, sharply.
"Outsiders bring hunger. Always. We protect."
Protect us?
Dr. Prill asked incredulously.
By hunting us?
"By saving you," James translated, "from whatever hunger is." The chief made a gesture, and one of his people brought forward something wrapped in hide. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a twisted piece of metal with symbols etched into it.
"Sheep falls. God's prisoners. No difference when death comes. We learn. We adapt. We survive."
The chief's broken speech was gaining fluency as he continued.
10 cycles, hunger sleeps. 10 cycles, hunger wakes. Hunger smells metal, smells different. Hunger hunts.
"What is hunger?" Creel demanded. Instead of answering directly, the chief led them deeper into the cave system, to a chamber whose walls were covered in crude drawings. The images depicted a massive, amorphous creature with tentacles and multiple mouths shown attacking humanoid figures.
"Hunger,"
the chief said simply.
"It wakes. You brought it earlier with sky fire.
He meant their ship.
Now it hunts."
"That's why you destroyed our vessel," James realized. "You were trying to minimize the attraction." The chief nodded.
"Cave's safe. Only place. Now we fight together or die."
Flim stepped forward, drawing himself up to his full height, which was still considerably shorter than the chief.
"Now see here, we are diplomats and scientists, not warriors. We can't fight."
The chief's laughter cut him off, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the chamber.
"No diplomats on Ragnarok. Only predators and prey."
In that moment, staring into the chief's scarred face, James recognized a fundamental truth. The feral humans hadn't regressed. They'd specialized. Every adaptation, every ritual, every weapon was designed for one purpose: survival on a world that wanted them dead. "We'll help," James said, ignoring Flim's sputtering objections. "Tell us what we need to do." The next few hours were a crash course in survival on Ragnarok. The feral humans, who called themselves the Forsaken, prepared for battle with an intensity that impressed even James. They coated their bodies in toxic plant extracts that would mask their scent and poison anything that bit them. They checked and rechecked primitive but effective weapons: spears tipped with predator fangs, bolas made from salvaged wire and teeth, nets woven from processed plant fibers and weighted with metal scraps. James was given a crude but lethal blade fashioned from a piece of the crashed ship's hull. The other survivors received similar weapons, along with minimal protective gear made from treated hides and salvaged materials.
"This hunger,"
Dr. Prill asked one of the Forsaken, a scarred woman who was showing her how to apply the protective plant toxins.
what exactly is it?
Death,
The woman answered simply.
it hunt by sound, by movement. It cry stops prey.
She made a gesture to her ears.
You hear, you freeze. Then tentacles come.
A neural disruptor,
Dr. Prill theorized.
hypersonic frequencies that temporarily paralyze the prey response.
The woman shrugged, not understanding or caring about the scientific explanation. Meanwhile, Flim cornered James as he was testing the balance of his blade.
Ambassador, this is insanity. We are diplomats, not soldiers. Surely there's a way to...
"You heard the big man, Administrator," James said flatly. "Some things just want to eat you. I'd rather eat than be eaten."
But these savages,
Flim gestured around at the Forsaken.
they're barely human anymore. We should be finding a way to evacuate them, to rehabilitate them, not joining their primitive battle rituals.
James fixed him with a hard stare. "You still don't understand what you're seeing, do you? These people aren't savages. They're specialists. Everything about them, every scar, every weapon, every ritual serves a purpose. They've adapted to survive an environment that should have killed them within days."
But they're so violent,
Flim protested weakly. "Violence is a tool," James said. "One that humans have always excelled at using when necessary." He leaned closer to Flim. "Why do you think every species was so quick to give us a seat at the table when we achieved faster than light travel? It wasn't our trade goods they valued." Before Flim could respond, a horn blast echoed through the caves. The Forsaken immediately moved to defensive positions. The chief appeared, now wearing crude armor made from predator hides reinforced with salvaged metal.
"It comes,"
he announced.
"Prepare."
The attack began at dusk. First, a keening wail that seemed to vibrate through the very rock of the caves. James felt his muscles try to lock, but the Forsaken had prepared for this. They'd given the survivors plugs made from a waxy fungal growth that partially blocked the paralytic effect. Then came the tentacles, dozens of them, pushing through every entrance to the cave system. They were a sickly pale color, covered in suckers that left smoldering marks on whatever they touched. The Forsaken responded with brilliant violence, severing tentacles with bladed weapons, burning the stumps with caustic plant sap that made the creature recoil. James found himself fighting alongside the chief, defending one of the main entrances. He was shocked by the Forsaken's fighting style. They took horrific injuries without slowing, continuing to fight with a detachment that bordered on indifference to pain. One man had his arm nearly severed by a tentacle, but continued fighting one-handed, using the spurting blood to blind the creature's sensory organs. During a lull in the attack, Dr. Prill moved among the wounded, applying her medical knowledge as best she could. She seemed simultaneously horrified and fascinated by the Forsaken's physiology.
Their pain tolerance is off the charts.
She told James as she bandaged a cut on his arm.
And their healing rate, I've never seen anything like it. It's as if their entire biology has been optimized for combat survival.
Humans evolved as persistence hunters, James explained, wincing as she tightened the bandage. Our ancestors would chase prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. Being able to keep going despite injury, to heal quickly, to adapt to almost any environment, these were always our strengths. The Forsaken have just taken these traits to their logical extreme. Flim had taken shelter in a side chamber, as far from the fighting as possible. When James checked on him, the alien administrator was shaking, his skin a mottled patchwork of stress coloration.
How?
Flim asked hoarsely.
How can they fight like that? I thought humans were diplomats, traders, civilized beings.
James crouched beside him. That's just the mask we wear, Administrator. Under the right circumstances, or the wrong ones, every human is capable of becoming what you see here.
Even you?
Flim asked, really looking at James for perhaps the first time. James didn't answer. He didn't need to. The hunger launched its main assault just before dawn. This time, it didn't just send tentacles. It came itself, a massive amorphous body pushing into the largest cave entrance. It defied easy description. Part octopus, part slug, part nightmare. Multiple eyes of different sizes dotted its undulating mass. Mouths opened and closed along its surface, each lined with different configurations of teeth. It moved with a terrible, deliberate intelligence, probing for weaknesses, focusing attacks on the most vulnerable defenders. The chief was injured early in the assault, a tentacle piercing his shoulder and pinning him briefly to the cave wall. James freed him with a decisive slash of his blade, then took temporary command when the chief's wound proved more serious than it first appeared. Under James's direction, the Forsaken set traps using the aliens' remaining technology combined with their own toxic weapons. Flim found himself reluctantly drawn into the planning, his administrative mind providing unexpected insights into maximizing their limited resources.
If we route them through the narrow passage,
Flim suggested, pointing to a cave map the chief had drawn in the dirt,
we could concentrate our forces.
James nodded. Good. Creel, take your people and set the charges here and here. He pointed to strategic weak points in the cave ceiling. We'll collapse these sections to force it along our chosen path. In the midst of battle planning, Dr. Prill worked frantically to analyze a sample of the hunger's severed tissue.
It has an unusual cellular structure,
she reported.
Highly specialized sensory organs throughout its body, but they seem particularly sensitive to certain chemical compounds.
She held up a vial of fluid extracted from a cave fungus.
This might disorient it, if we could deliver it directly to its sensory clusters.
I can do that, James said. The plan came together quickly. Use controlled cave-ins to direct the hunger into a killing zone, then deliver Dr. Prill's compound directly to its sensory organs while the main force attacked its more vulnerable areas. The execution was brutal. James, covered in mud and blood, fought alongside the injured chief with a savagery that shocked even the Forsaken. Both men took horrific injuries, but continued fighting with inhuman determination. Flim watched in horror and fascination as James completely shed his diplomatic persona, becoming something primal and terrifying, indistinguishable from the Forsaken, except for his tactile commands. The moment of truth came when James, bleeding from a dozen wounds, climbed onto the hunger's writhing mass and drove a spear loaded with Dr. Prill's compound directly into what they'd identified as the creature's primary sensory cluster. The monster convulsed, its tentacles thrashing wildly, crushing several Forsaken warriors who didn't retreat quickly enough. As the hunger reeled in confusion, the chief led the final assault, driving salvaged metal spears into the creature's now exposed central mass. With a keening wail that shattered stone, the hunger collapsed in on itself, its body dissolving into a noxious fluid that sizzled against the cave floor. The victory came at a terrible cost. Dozens of Forsaken lay dead or dying. James himself was barely conscious, his body a map of lacerations and contusions. The chief wasn't much better off, his milky eye now gone completely, leaving an empty socket that he didn't bother to bandage. As Dr. Prill treated the wounded, the chief approached James, who was sitting propped against a wall, allowing a Forsaken healer to stitch a particularly nasty cut on his thigh.
You fight good,
The chief said simply.
like Forsaken.
James nodded, too exhausted for words.
Could stay.
The chief offered.
Become true Forsaken. No masks.
For a moment, something flickered in James's eyes. A longing, perhaps, for the simplicity of this existence, where strength was measured in survival, where diplomatic niceties were unnecessary, where a man was judged solely by his actions. But the moment passed. "I have responsibilities," James said finally. The chief nodded, understanding in his remaining eye.
All wear masks, even here.
He thumped his chest.
Inside, still human.
3 days later, a rescue ship arrived, responding to the emergency beacon they managed to activate using salvaged parts from their destroyed vessel. As they prepared to leave, James found himself standing at the cave entrance with Flim, looking out at the jungle that had claimed so many lives.
I've submitted my report to the department,
Flim said quietly.
I've recommended that Ragnarok be declared a protected zone. No settlement, no visitation.
The Forsaken would appreciate that, James replied.
Not for their sake,
Flim admitted.
for ours.
James raised an eyebrow questioningly.
I've spent my career interacting with human diplomats, traders, artists,
Flim explained.
I thought I understood your species, but what I saw here,
He shuddered visibly.
if this is what humans become when necessity demands it, perhaps it's better for the galaxy that you wear your masks of civilization.
James watched as the Forsaken lined up at the cave entrance, a guard of honor for their departing allies. Their bodies were covered in fresh scars from battle, their faces impassive, their weapons still stained with the hunger's fluids. "We're not so different, you know," James said. "The diplomat and the warrior, they're both still me. Different tools for different environments."
And which is the real you?
Flim asked. James didn't answer immediately. As they boarded the rescue vessel, James straightened his torn and bloodied formal attire. Flim watched in fascination as the transformation took place, the wild, feral warrior receding, replaced by the polished diplomat with disturbing ease. "The galaxy doesn't want to meet the real us, Flim," James said finally. "Trust me on that." As they lifted off, James looked down at the jungle below. The Forsaken had arranged massive warning symbols visible from space, not to keep others away from the hunger, but to keep the galaxy safe from them. He touched the fresh scars on his face, souvenirs of Ragnarok's harsh lessons. Under his neatly pressed uniform, his body told the truth that his diplomatic smile concealed. Every human was just one bad day away from becoming Forsaken.